But yeah, let's take a look at the Grosser Hund project overall. I think now's a good time to kind of get into the build. This is the Grosser Hund build that, once again, ultimately won the non-Gunpla category for this year's Otakuthon. And this model here was something that I bought early in the spring, or possibly, well, I definitely started building it early in the spring, and I had been working on it kind of steadily throughout these months, all the way up until effectively, last week, really. And which is to say that I wasn't working on it like every single time only, right? It was my main project. Every summer I feel like there's always like a main project that I'm working on, and this was this year's. Arch dinner, nice. No wallpaper, yeah. I'm gonna have to get onto that. Find myself some wallpaper, a nice 5-star wallpaper. But yeah, this is the start of the process, and I wanted to take a picture of this because this is a great example of what the Maschinen Krieger building experience is like. I've had a couple of folks already kind of get in touch with me, people who are more familiar with Gundam and interested, expressing interest in getting into this series, this line, and what was it like? What is it like? I've heard it's tough. I've heard it's challenging, and this is a great example because what you're seeing right here is a plate, a runner with a, effectively a plate of plastic, and molded onto that plate are rivets. If you look at the kind of top corner there, there's the very same rivets that are attached to the runner in your typical way, as most parts are, with a gate and then the runner itself. But the very same rivets and bolts are also simply molded on this plate, and you then have to slice them off with a sharp knife and then place them onto the model itself and glue it. And that's the main thing about many of these Maschinen Krieger Hasegawa kits, at the very least, is that they require glue, cement glue and super glue. And you're going to have to cement these rivets and bolts like on a very flush, a very smooth part. There's really, sometimes there are little guides for where you're going to put these things, but many times there is not. And because they're so small, it's probably hard to get across exactly how small these things are. But many times I would slice these things off and then instantly lose them. They effectively just disappear into the ether because a sliced piece of plastic like that is barely distinguishable from like any kind of shavings or like like just extra piece of plastic that you might have cut off. But that's the Maschinen Krieger experience. It's different. It's definitely different. It's definitely more challenging than something like a Gundam. But I think it's a good challenge if you're someone that has built a lot of Gundams and you're kind of thinking like, what's the next thing? I need something a little more substantial. I need something a little meatier. Well, this is a great example. And give me a second here. There we are. Yeah. The parts are dark black. I don't think that there was any other multicolored parts. Just simply black or dark gray brown. Another difference with this line is that it's recommended to paint them more so than your typical Gundam as well. And this is kind of the model shaping up. We already have the tubes in place, and you're also going to have to deal with mold lines, or rather seam lines, much more. They're not really designed or disguised in a way that a lot of Gundams do, which is amazing. It's an amazing feat of design to consider those manufacturing um, the process of manufacturing and then turn it into a part of its design. But for this, yeah, you're gonna have to clean up all of this, and that's what I'm kind of getting at here, is that you're gonna have to put in a little bit of effort to hide those things. But at the same time, it's a good way to exercise your modeling skills, I guess, if you want to say. And now, having built the basic form of the model, I kind of started to get into the customization part. And this is something that I've done a couple times now, but effectively, it's like applying a texture to the surface of the model to create the sense of cast iron or casted steel, as well as like the corrosion that happens with rust. Sometimes if you look at like rusty vehicles or rusty machinery, the corrosion and the rust starts to bubble up from underneath the paint, and this is a way that you can convey that. You can convey this a sense of different things with this process, which is taking milliput or any other kind of like sculpting material. It was a little hard to say, and I was dabbing it on with a brush, and it was thinned down to like kind of like a pasty, sludgy quality. And I took a really roughed up brush. Of course, you got to use a rough brush. Don't use your nice brushes to do this. And you're gonna kind of just dab the surface with that, and allow some time to dry, of course. And then you can go in and sand it to kind of smooth it out and make it look not as aggressive. But you can also achieve a similar effect simply by using thin cement. And I did do that elsewhere on the model, was simply applying a layer of thin cement and then again dabbing that surface to kind of melt it while simultaneously pulling up the surface in its melted state, pulling up a part of it and creating that texture. So that's what you're seeing here. It looks a little bit like a crustacean at this point, which I think some folks pointed out. I thought that was really funny. And it would be kind of interesting to pursue that, actually, is like kind of lean into that more and make like a crustacean mech. And again, this is another look at the surface. It looks very aggressive here, but you'll see later when it's all primed and painted that it kind of, when it's all primed black, it looks much more uniform and harmonious. But also, this is an example of some of the extra detail that I put on, including the wires. This was just some very thin gauged wire from the dollar store, and we kind of ran the missile launching grenades. These are actually smoke grenades, the kind of cylindrical parts that you're seeing here. I thought it might look cool if we had wires running to some kind of unit, which you see kind of here at the bottom, this at the center bottom of the screen here. This is like a gray extra piece, which is something that I added to kind of be some kind of computer mechanism to help launch the smoke grenades. And we have very thin pla plate kind of acting as a strap or a kind of fixture to lock in those wires in place. I'm not all that used to working with wires and getting them nice and straight and bending them properly. It was only later that I realized that people use like a kind of rig, or I forget the term, but you can buy like a small little tool that will help you bend the wires to keep them straight and consistent, rather than like, I don't know, I think it was just bending them around a brush or something. And again, we have much more milliput applied to the surface compared to the previous pictures, because I just felt like it needed more. In hindsight, maybe I didn't need to put this much, or maybe use it a bit more sparingly, but it is far more textured at this point. This is a very messy process as well, or maybe I just don't know how to do it in a way that's tidy. But it's definitely recommended to lay out like a piece of paper before getting into this. It's definitely recommended to wear gloves. Yeah. And here's an example of the parts sanded and then sprayed black. And for as aggressive as it looked in the previous pictures, now you can kind of get a sense of how it's going to look painted now that it's all uniformly black, and you're definitely seeing like the texture. Uh, what you're seeing there on the right side of the spoon-like shape is a bolt, but yeah, there's a lot of small micro texture. Um, but it feels real in a weird way. It feels like maybe not something truly realistic, but it feels somehow authentic, which I like. And yeah, so starting to paint this thing, I'm kind of seeing and exploring the color scheme. I didn't actually have a concrete color scheme in mind. I kind of had a vague notion of wanting to do something that looked like a synthwave 80s sci-fi poster or a book, like a sci-fi novel from the 70s or 80s. I kind of had that notion. But at this stage, after this first painting session, I was already feeling like the colors as we are seeing right now look a little too like red and green, which is very like, you make that instant association red and green with like Christmas. So I actually I went into Photoshop and kind of manipulated the colors from this to shift it more into like something that I felt more accurately matched what I had in mind, and I kind of shifted it more towards like turquoise and purple, which I don't think I have a picture here in the slides, but that's something you can do when you're working on a color scheme, is like test things out in Photoshop rather than like laying on layers of paint and you don't like it and then you have to strip the paint off and then paint it again. You can use Photoshop and you're not going to waste your time and effort in your paint. Interestingly enough, though, I feel like ultimately the color scheme still kind of had that aspect of like red and green, but it was done in a way that I felt more comfortable with than what you're seeing here. And some of these pictures are out of order, my apologies, but this is an example of how crusty the surface of the model looks with all of that texture. And I think at this point, yes, I've kind of shifted the colors more to like the space that I wanted, like a little more turquoise, a little more teal, and a little more purplish with the red. I've also gone in and added the masked stripes that you're seeing on the body there and the tip of the weapon. That's masked off and then just simply dabbed on with paint. Everything is hand painted, by the way. Most of you folks know that already about my approach, but yeah, all hand painted. And I do a lot of sponge painting. It's not something I had mentioned just yet, but I do a lot of like rather than using a brush, I build up the layers of color using different kinds of tones of, for example, the turquoise, the green, the purple, and that's all built up in layers of sponging or dabbing on with a brush. And the point of that is to allow some of the underlying layer to show through, and it creates this speckled effect, which helps to complement the texture that I've already applied to the model. But it also provides a sense of reality, I think, because when you look at something as weathered and worn as this is, there isn't just simply that flat color. You're going to see many shades, many tones And that's kind of part of the approach. It's also, I guess, more of a painterly approach rather than simply getting like smooth transitions, smooth gradients. Creating a texture like this is another way of like creating visual interest, if you want to put it that way. And again, my apologies. These photos are kind of out of order, but yeah, this is the same surface with the details all kind of sprayed black, but yeah, there's the wires and everything. Another look at the surface. At this point, I've gone in and started to apply the decals. Also, one thing to note was during the summer, I took part in the Plastic Model Weekender, Pumuwu in other words, and that's a large streaming marathon event hosted by Bad Gunpla, and they raise money to help Alzheimer's, or rather to help fight Alzheimer's, cure Alzheimer's. And luckily enough, I applied and I was allowed to take part of this, and I thought that it might be fun to do a weathering demonstration to show my approach on stream for my segment. So a lot of what you're seeing here is like me painting the model to a point, up to the point where I was going to then weather it for the stream. Arch of the texture really stands out on the zoom pics. Yeah, yeah, that's something that doesn't really come across when you look at the model like from a distance as a whole. And yeah, when you zoom in, you can really see that. But yeah, there's the decals. The decals, that was also a little tricky because the surface, as you've all seen, is so bumpy, is so textured, that simply floating a decal on top of that, it would not really adhere. So I really had to go in and apply the ma.k softer on top in a couple of layers, you know, like let it dry, apply it again, use a Q-tip to kind of gently push it down, and then apply it again to get to that point where the decal is kind of melted enough and kind of blended enough flush to the surface of this very textured model now. And as a matter of fact, parts of the decal would kind of break because I was maybe definitely applying a bit too much force and possibly too much of the ma.k softer, and it was actually kind of, and the surface is so textured that like it was kind of erupting through and poking through the decal at some parts. But I was kind of fine with that in the sense that this was going to get really weathered, and that was only going to help my cause in a lot of ways. And yeah, so here's an example of like, at this point, I would say this is very close to being finished, as an example of something where the decal is applied, and then weathering and scratching, as you can see, has been layered on top to create that like blended feel. Like it's now truly feeling like a part of the model itself. And we have some oil stains kind of streaking down from some bolts and scratches. And you also see towards the bottom of this piece a bit of that purple, which is again part of that like sponging process, where I was laying down a darker color, in this case purple, and then more oriented towards the top of the model, I was layering like turquoise, for example, towards the top, and that creates a sense of shading. Now, when it comes to like shading, you might think that you would just simply add black, right? Black for shaded areas, white for the highlighted areas, but it's a little more visually interesting if you can kind of think about it differently with regards to like how light plays off with one another, which is a whole other thing which we probably aren't going to get into now, but yeah. Here's an example of the rust that I applied to the interior parts of the model, and I think it looks great. As a matter of fact, I think that at this point it looks really good, and then I would kind of go on to put a bit more paint on it, and I think we kind of lost a bit of this kind of variation of the texture of the paint, and I was using the Dirty Down Rust product. Light TED Talk. Yeah, this is a Dirty Down Rust. It's an effects paint, which can be a little tricky to use, and I feel like I haven't perfectly mastered it. But this is an example of some of the results that you can get with it, which is really neat. And yeah, so more kind of weathering and integrating the masked off design, like the stripe. This is an example of like how we take that white painted stripe and then I apply the dark green to kind of make it more blended and weathered as the rest of it is. Also, what you're seeing here is a lot of the purple kind of showing through in those darker shaded areas, and again, that was part of my thought process of making it look a bit more like a kind of synthwave illustration. Do you know what I mean? Although, again, in hindsight, I think that after applying more layers of oil and rust and effects paint, some of the nice little subtleties of the purple here kind of get lost. And so that's something that I feel like I want to keep in mind for next time, is preserving much more of this in the final build, which is, it's not impossible in a lot of ways. Like, I think it's still possible to kind of bring some of this back in the model, in the finished product as it is now. But at the same time, we probably need to move on with our lives from this model. Do you know what I mean? And yeah, so much more weathering and integrating decals. This was an early concept of possibly displaying the model on a much smaller cube. You guys all know I love cubes. I have a couple of these now. You can get them at Michael's. Actually, I'm pretty sure Simon Lamb bought the same cubes from Michael's to put his own Maschinen Krieger model on on display. But yeah, ultimately I did choose a different route. One thing that I found was a little difficult with this model was taking pictures of it as well, because there's something about the shaded areas and and natural light kind of casting shadows on this that was kind of working for the model and sometimes working against the model. So in some ways it was a little tricky to take pictures of the model. That was something that I was discovering already. Oh, you see those cubes a lot, yeah. Shout out to Simon Michael Lamb. Here on the back, there's this kind of engine turbine. No, not turbine. There's a kind of like engine. And I painted it like it was supposed to be emanating glowing light, like it was powering the entire machine, and it was just like glowing with power. But it also looks like a weak point in a video game. Like, it looks like something that is the weak point, and you got to shoot that part to do extra damage. But I try to simulate the look of like the part glowing, and this is part of the process. It's not like the finished product, and I'm still learning how to do this. It's like object source lighting, where you're kind of deliberately painting the effect of light rather than relying on natural light to convey that, or rather even just something like an LED. A lot of folks use LEDs for their models. Object source lighting is a way of imitating that simply by painting. And it's something I want to practice, and that's what we're seeing here. But it also is something to think about when you're displaying your model, if you're doing something for a competition, because it is going to be looked at 360 degrees. It is a model that people will look at from the front, the side, and the back. So you do need to give some love and attention to the back, and I thought that this might be an interesting way to have a little bit of a surprise detail in the back. The boss's weakness. Yeah, focus mode. That's like the robot slaying Monster Hunter game. Why isn't there something like that? Basically Monster Hunter, but robots. Yeah, and so this is, at this point, this is really like pretty much done in terms of like the level of quality or the level of like detail applied to the surface. And there's just a lot of texture going on. That's something that I'm really interested in, even as far back as like college. I remember there was a instructor who was like our technical illustration instructor, who was teaching us like how to convey various kinds of textures, like brick, like rust, etc. And I remember showing him my samples of rust, and he was like, whoa, this is above and beyond what I was expecting from any of you. And that really hasn't changed. Nothing's really changed. I'm still weirdly obsessed with various kinds of textures, whether it be moss, rust, verdigris, rusty patches. Yeah, and again, we have a lot of dirty down rust, the product. It's all over the place here, but I did go back and apply just straight up acrylic paint, dabbing that on with a sponge to create more kind of like speckled rust, like the brighter hits of orange. And I think that was kind of important to do to create more of a bridge between the darker, dirty down rust areas and the rest of the model. Also, you can see that there's a purple tube running from the leg. That would be scraped off. All the paint on the leg gets scraped off much later because it's already cracking here. What a show off. Good job, Ippo. Well, that's just my desk, really. There's a little guest appearance by Milk Senpai, Milko Baggins. Again, I had mentioned the Plamo Weekender. This was a part of the fun that all happened during the Plamo Weekender. And at this point, having mostly finished the model, it was time to start thinking about the diorama. And I'm kind of happy that what you see here in this very rough sketch ultimately is what ended up happening in the final product. We have rocks, and I pointed out industrial stuff. The Grosser Hund, more rocks, and there is a human there. And I actually did plan on putting a human model there, but ultimately decided against it, mostly because I think that the layout of the model, the kind of the way it was set up already, there really wouldn't be enough space for the human model, and it might have detracted in some ways. But I think I will just finish up that model, and there's probably some pictures of it here, which we'll get to. I think I'll just finish it and put it back into the diorama now, but for the purposes of like displaying it at Otakuthon, I just felt like, for one, it wasn't necessary, and number two, like, to get it to a level where I was really happy with it, I just didn't have enough time. So the diorama is taking shape. This is actually an IKEA frame, And I built up the like bulk of it on the inside with cardboard and styrofoam foam core. But the rocks that you're seeing here, they're made from cork, and they're very roughly chopped up and stacked, and they're very kind of blocky at the moment. But I would then go in and kind of sculpt it, like sculpt the surface of these once it dried to make it look a little more natural. You'll probably see a picture of that soon enough. It's a little rough fit with the model. Honestly, at this point, it looks a little awkward, but I just decided to keep going. Like even in this state, just everything about this is kind of questionable. It's like, is this gonna work out? But I just decided to keep going. Here's an example of the rocks after it's been carved a little bit. Again, this is simply cork, so it's fairly easy to carve into. It is kind of messy as well. You do leave a lot of little particles, but it looks pretty good. In hindsight, again, like for all the stuff that I'm doing here, it's not like everything was a slam dunk. I had a lot of false starts, a lot of things that I would do differently, a lot of stuff that looked crappy and then I had to change it. And this whole rock surface, I think if I were to do it again, I might coat it with like plaster or some clay to kind of smooth it out more. Do you know what I mean? But ultimately, it looked pretty fine. It looked okay. I did reorient some of those rocks so that we would have much more bulk up at the front as well, rather than having everything just be in the background. And I also sketched out where the model was going to stand, as well as the human figure too. I was already considering where that was going to be. This is a proper scaled human, 1 in 20th scale, to this environment. And it looks really funny because he looks really huge. But that's a weird thing about making dioramas, is the whole context of everything. I think that once you add a few more things, you can kind of provide a better sense of the scale and much more context to the scene. But this looks awkward already. So here we're adding some industrial bits. That was part of that sketch that I had shown. And those mechanical parts come from a Kotobukiya kit. It's the frame arms Griffin, or Griffin, a model that I had picked up on sale from a different convention last year, I think. And having assembled it, it just seemed to me like it could be a kit that would maybe be better served as kit bashing fodder rather than using it as a model, rather than using it and painting it as a model, which I thought looked fine, but it just didn't really inspire me all that much. And I felt much more inspired to use it for kit bashing material. So that's what you're seeing here. And I mean, yeah, this is like the legs. It's part of the legs, part of the arms. The foot is the thing at the front. And yeah, I ended up hand priming all of this with gesso. That's something that I've done in the past. I think it would have been fine to just spray paint it, but doing it this way allowed me to provide a little texture to the surface of the industrial parts as well. So that's a part of it. And yeah, so we're starting to paint it. I actually spray painted the whole thing yellow, but the red parts that you're seeing here are all hand painted. And a part of the idea was to have like that interior framework of the Grosser Hund itself have that reddish purple parts be like the major color of the diorama, so that we create a connection there. And this was just like the first time where I loosely fit the model onto the diorama. And it's one thing that I had noticed was like I had this rocky outcropping at the front, and I could make his hand rest on the rocks, and that became like a part of like the posing of the scene, because it felt like it was now connected to the diorama. Do you know what I mean? And that somehow like that hand, you could really like get a good look and appreciate the creepy mechanical hand, and it was connecting to the scene. Something about that felt really good to me. And yeah, so we were just at this point I just added some masked off parts to the mechanical parts, which again is a pretty easy thing to do, like just masking off a stripe, and it looks really cool. I don't know. I just think that's really neat. There's also some decals that I placed on these parts. It's probably hard to see, but again, that's just another extra little detail that you can add. The rocks have had a lot of work done to them as well. As we go on, I would kind of layer on different kinds of colors of beige, bleached bone colors, yellows, dark browns, just to create much more variety rather than having like a simply straight up yellow rocky surface. You know, this was intended to be kind of like a deserty scene, but having some variation by applying washes, very thin down brown paint, even going as far as like individually painting little pieces of rock. All of that helps to kind of make the scene a bit more believable. And that's a good example of the kind of like stripe there, as well as the decal. This is a little further back in the process, so you can see how like having it just straight up yellow is a little funky. So the red antenna structure that you see here, this is a look at the whole thing that I put together, and some of that is made up of, most of it is made up of the very same Kotobukiya frame arms model. Parts of it are like the arm, parts of it are like the shoulder. Some of it here, the gray parts are like the inner frame. And the idea was to make a kind of antenna situation to poke up from the background. We also have some parts from a tank, like a small mini tank. And I'm not too experienced with kit bashing, but I felt like making these background elements kind of made me much more comfortable with kit bashing, because it's pretty low stakes. Like at the end of the day, it's just the background. But it helped me feel a lot more loose and comfortable with just taking all these random parts and smushing them together. Although it still took some time to really get to a point where I liked it. At this point, we had decided to go to Otakuthon, and I thought like I would really like to have the frame from IKEA textured, scrapped up, scratched and textured. So yeah, I just went in, and like this was actually really hard to scratch off, because they used some really thick, solid paint to color that frame. And I was thinking that if I had scraped off the paint, I would get like some nice kind of wood texture underneath. But the wood that they were using was like a kind of composite wood chipped thing, so it really had no wood grain texture. Do you know what I mean? So I actually really went in there with a steel brush, and I used like all sorts of things to really kind of rough up that surface and get that look. But at the same time, keeping some of that white showing through to make it look kind of weathered. And I would then go on and apply some light inking, light paint to kind of get the shadows and make it look a lot more weathered. And really, at this point, having decided that we were going to go to a talkathon, at this point, it's about those little details. The model itself is done. The background is, the diorama is more or less done, but it's those little things that you can add to give you a bit of a boost, a bit of a bump that can separate you from someone else. Because if two models are of equal quality, right? If two models, two builds are of equal quality, the judges are going to look for that extra little thing. What's that extra little thing that this person did that the other person didn't, that's going to put person A ahead? And so, and also, it's just my weird little obsessive brain that if I have enough time, I can do these things. And as weird as it might be, like scratching up the frame was weirdly important to me to do. And so that's why we did it. And here's the human model that I had bought with the intention of including in this diorama. And there might be some pictures of it painted, at least semi-finished. But these are actually official too, which is really cool. And luckily enough, one of my local stores, I don't go to this particular store too often, but one of my local stores, they do sell these resin figures. So yeah, and it also comes with some decals too. And again, getting close to finished, here is another kind of shot of the model with a rough idea for the pose. I didn't settle on this pose. This is a much more aggressive pose, leaning kind of towards the viewer. And but we always have the hand grasping one of those rocks in the foreground. Ultimately, I chose a much more kind of like stoic pose, a placid pose, but that was an idea. And that's a look at the illustration by Ko Yokoyama sensei himself for the model here. I went with a different color scheme. Here's a look at the water slides that the model comes. Yeah, there's the model there. As a tree, honestly, I think they look a little weird because they're meant to be tattoos. They're meant to be tattoos for the model. It looks a little weird to me. Yeah, so you guys know I like gamer grass. Here is some of the grass, kind of dry bush that I thought might look really nice for the model. But yeah, sorry. Thank you once again, Fiasco, for the raid. I probably said that 5 times already. But if you need to go, and that goes for anyone coming in through the raid, please tend to what you need. If you need to sleep, if you need to eat, if you need to wash the car, if you need to wash the dog, if you need to feed the dog, anything dog related, please help your dogs out, or cats. Did you ever use Vallejo mud? I'm trying to get the Vallejo mud. I have not, but I used a Citadel cracked earth, and that looked pretty good. Gamer grass is a fave. Yeah, gamer grass is sick. Here for a bit. Thank you for hanging out for a bit, Fiasco. Okay, so let's get into this. What you are seeing right now is a piece of plot plate that I cut out, beveled, textured, and then painted the same kind of technique that I used throughout the model. This is a plaque that this would go on to be a plaque that I would put onto the base of the model. And the idea was to write Großer Hund. the idea was to write the name of the model kit uh, using a stencil that I would trace from the box or the instruction manual, and then make a mask, and then paint, uh, apply the mask, and then paint it. However, I cut it out and it looked like trash. And this is with like 2 days left to go for the convention. So the clock is ticking. And ultimately, I decided to just freehand it. But then the thought of freehanding Grosser Hund was too daunting for me. And so ultimately, I decided to use Big Dog, which is roughly translated Grosser Hund, if I'm not mistaken. Two L's is a Y. Tortilla. Vallejo? Oh, God. But yeah, you can see it. Hund. It's spelled like this. It's German, if I'm not mistaken. But it actually has the funny looking, the two S's are like a B. But yeah, what you're seeing there in the corner there is freehand. I did this over the course of like 3 hours, 4 hours, just freehanding 6 letters. And then the 1 and 3 are 2 separate decals that I put together to make 13. I ran out of a single decal that was the number 13. So I had to find 2 appropriately sized decals that could become 13. Vanilla isn't here. Oh, God. Yeah, that's what it is. Although, is it 2 of those funny things? It's just one. It's just one of the funny looking bee things for this model. But yeah, that's a look at. This took a little while, but again, I felt like this would be a nice touch, a nice little touch to show that I care, in other words. And it's something that I would like to do for more of my models, but really it's a matter of time. Picture of the normal model. I might. This is all the stuff packed in this box. This was very awkward to carry around during the convention itself. But thankfully I could fold it up. This is a box from IKEA. And I was walking around with this dorky Halloween bag. This is the biggest bag and the strongest bag that I had. And it's not like the thing weighed a ton, but it did weigh it wasn't nothing. And again, like people were bumping into me. It was stressing me out carrying this thing. Is it just one? Oh, it is just one, but I had the second because you wanted it. Thank you. I wanted it. But yeah, here's an example of, or a shot of both of the award-winning models. Yeah, I was very happy to achieve this much. I feel like there's a big question mark when it comes to Maschinen Krieger as far as something that's appealing for people. It's kind of an acquired taste. It's very different compared to something like Gundam or stuff that you see in anime and all that. But I've always liked it, even since I was in high school. I just couldn't really afford anything. I couldn't afford like these model kits, and they were very hard to find. I had to go like downtown Toronto to even see them. But now it's kind of cool that they're a little easier to find, and it's cool to finally build them and experience it. And I feel like I'm at a point where I can kind of push it and make them look as good as they can look, at least with my current skill level. A giant Gunpla bodyguard? Nice. You gonna wear the outfit? Yeah, and then the gun tank also was something that was a pretty quick build and a pretty quick paint job, and to get third place is really encouraging. Um, yeah, that's another shot of the model. I got magnets. Oh, we were talking about that fiasco. I magnetized part of this diorama so that it would be easier to assemble and disassemble, but honestly, it didn't really help all that much. Maybe that's just my magnet inexperience. How the fuck did it work? Here's an example. I was talking about like the extra little touches that you can add to your model. Like everything is practically done at this point, but I really wanted to kind of push it more. I had this idea in mind that there would be cables running from the different parts of the model uh, to the background, and I didn't really know how to make the cable. I had a lot of different things, including wires, including rubbery tubes, including parts from a Zoids model, like a firm plastic cable thing. And I tried a bunch of different ways and it just didn't work out. The best strategy ultimately was to take those Zoid cable parts and attach them together and then run a piece of very thin wire wrapped around it so that now it could be much more posable, because that was the issue I was running into, was like using a piece of metal wire. Like I had a thick gauge metal wire that was really hard to pose in a convincing rubbery way, but then actually using rubbery tubes was too rubbery. So we needed to just do something, which was the both. Is the basing a significant part of the scoring? So I would say that the basing can help separate you from everyone else, because the example that I always come back to is this idea that if there are two models kits, if there's two models that are of equal quality, they're both very, very good. The judges are then at that point going to look at what is the things that separate the two. What are the small and big differences? And so that might come down to the difference between decal application, the difference between adding extra details like scribing or plot plates. And it also can come down to the difference between someone who does a base and someone who does not. But it's also something that I'm personally really interested in. Do you know what I mean? Like I have a lot of models where I make little bases, little dioramas for, that I just make for myself. And I think that there are fun little things that create a sense of narrative and atmosphere to a model. It's just a weird little me thing, I guess. And here's an example of the partially painted human figure, which was omitted from the final thing because I just felt like I didn't need it, and also I couldn't work on it with enough time. And yeah, that's about it. That's actually the first picture in this slide.